Well, welcome. I am your first speaker for today, and it's a great honour to be speaking with you. I'm reflecting that the words that are on this stage and part of Open State are words that I had tapped into my keyboard when I was starting my PhD in 2007, and when I gave my first sort of presentation on what I was researching, everyone said, "What are you doing? What is that?" And it was all about how do we collaborate and engage citizens in government decision making. And so it's a real exciting point to be here and standing at this platform here in South Australia. I'm actually a Wagga girl, country girl, so not that far away from here. I'm based now in Canberra and I run a firm, and the name of the firm is ThinkPlace. We've had the privilege of working here with a number of the organisations here in South Australia, and it's all about empowering people in the process of designing and solving complex issues. I was really excited to make lots of notes in the opening address from your Premier, Jay, and I'm particularly struck by the statement involving people in a decision-making process that affects their lives. So I've been asked today to share with you some of my experiences, and I hope that, if anything, there's some points of inspiration and some areas that might get you something to think about a little bit as you embark on this Open State journey. So I've got a couple of quotes to start, and you'll be familiar with these, and particularly this one from Albert Einstein. But I like it because it constantly reminds me that we have to think differently, because no problem, even if it's the same topic area or domain, it's constantly changing. The way in which we work and operate and the way in which we interact and do things, we constantly need to be thinking, well, how do we tackle this differently? Another quote I quite like, and people have often heard the term wicked problems, is that we have to actually think differently because the problems themselves, in this case as described by C. West Churchman in 1967, they're a class of social system problems which are ill-formulated, where the information is confusing, where there are many clients and decision makers with conflicting values, and where the ramifications in the whole system are thoroughly confusing. So where do we start when that's what we're looking at? And what I'm excited to share with you today is that really what we're talking about is having an absolute belief that we're here to change existing situations into preferred ones. And I think that's at the heart of what you're talking about here with Open State, and embracing a quite wide and diverse set of views from who's in this room now and to the people that aren't even in this room that make up this wonderful state. So part of what I am here to talk to you today about is the platform that I guess, exercise every day, which is the application of design thinking to really drive behaviours that allow us to think differently and to get results at the end of the day. I thought I might just start with a quick story. It can be helpful just to sort of, rather than lecture at you about the points of what is design, and I won't be doing that today. I just wanted to share with you a story about a project that we worked on in Ghana, and the question was, how might we innovate for maternal, newborn and child health in Ghana? So the project was actually quite important in terms of actually dealing with quite significant issues to do with maternal mortality, and the recognition that it was a very complex issue that the government and a number of different agents in the system were trying to solve. And one of the areas they felt could be improved was actually the role of the community health nurse worker. So the project itself was not done alone, it was done with many different players, and I think that's a really important point to highlight, is that when systems are complex and lots of moving parts, we have to embrace more of a consortium of different players to actually come together to make sense of what's going on. So this particular project went over a number of years. It engaged 5 different rural districts and looked at around 300 community health nurses, and organisations such as Concern Worldwide, Grameen Foundation, and as well as the Ghanaian government in terms of the health area, were actually actively involved in saying we need to do something different. And our organisation played a role, particularly in how might we make a start into what is the experience of the community health nurse worker. What sort of image do you think I'm going to share with you? This is what, you go, what? It's a bike crashed up in a tree. Well, when you ask people what the experience of that community health nurse worker was, well, they are able to get out and about. There's facilities for transport. We put bikes out there, is what Central Office was saying. But when you went out there, you discovered the bikes are broken, they're never maintained, and they're just basically rubbish. And so there's a lot of tension between what the central thought the remote workers were doing And what we were uncovering is actually what does it really mean to be a community health care nurse worker, and what are the barriers that you actually face. This photo is a little bit more kind of like lots of things are going on, but if you sort of turned another degree, you'd be looking out into a context where there really isn't much contact with anyone. So I want you to imagine that there are these 300 odd workers who are going out and about, and they're travelling and servicing many different villages and communities. No language is the same, and they encounter many different problems, many of which they actually don't understand what to do, and there's no support, no one to call. So part of actually this project was actually put a bit of heart into the problem, which is rather than saying people aren't effective, they don't know how to do their job, they're not reading the manuals, it was about saying let's actually understand what is actually going on for these women who are out battling the different parts of the environment that they work in. So it's all good to go out there and gather these stories, but you need to be able to do something about it. So this project then went out and said, well, we actually need to engage people to participate, exactly what this whole open state is about. And where do you engage to participate? Do you bring people into a forum like this, or do you actually go to where they are? So this project is a great example, and this image illustrates it was taking workshops to the street. So it's more like a field shop. So how do you actually engage people on their terms and make people feel very comfortable? So if I'm in that environment, I certainly wouldn't look like this. I'd be much more relaxed, more relatable. So part of collaborating is actually being able to collaborate on terms that make sense for people. And so this project was actually about empowering both mothers, young people and the nurses to actually galvanise around, well, what is it we can do differently to make things better for you? It's actually about collaborating to break down some of those barriers. And some of those barriers can be verbalised and they're very obvious, and some of them aren't. And this particular photo is quite important. It may not mean much to you, but those two women are both nurses. One is in the white uniform, one is in the brown. The brown-dressed woman is actually the one that is in the remote context, and there's often a lot of friction between the white-dressed nurse and the brown-dressed nurse. Quite unnecessary, but there's often not much interaction that occurs between them. So part of this project was to break down that barrier by saying, why don't we actually come together and get you to work together, not on the problems of today, but about where could we go? So design is actually about appreciating, having empathy for today, but then saying, well, that's great, but we've got to do something more than that. So this image was actually about them collaborating in the early stages, trying to make sense, well, what could we do differently to improve your experience and the outcomes, which ultimately was about better health service. It's one thing to workshop and gather ideas and to feel good about understanding what could be different, but you have to go beyond that. And so part of design is actually to see value created. So in this particular project, it was actually about understanding those community health nurses and what was important to them. So part of this exercise was to actually say, well, why don't we actually leapfrog today? And if your experience was absolutely incredible, what would it be like? How would you describe it? What would it mean to you? And these are the sorts of statements that came out and said, if I could say as part of my role, this is what it was for me, the values that were lived, I think I would feel very proud about the role that I do. So those 8 different areas, and I'm going to be fast forwarding this project pretty quick for today's time, but those 8 areas were actually translated into a mobile device, an application. Originally there was an app designed, but it didn't work. So the app's not the highlight of my point to you. However, the app was enabled to really help these nurses because it actually reflected exactly the functions that they actually needed. This particular project has been extensively reviewed and also won some international awards for its value creation for those nurses, because the actual device, as the statements are saying there, the information is in front of them all of a sudden, but it was information that they actually needed, and that was actually uncovered through the design process and really co-designing what that and how that particular product needed to actually work. So sharing that quick story with you is to say, well, what is design? This is the design squiggle. If you don't know what that is, just Google it and you'll get Damien Newman squiggle up. We have this painted on our studio wall in Canberra. If you need this for therapy, paint it on your wall. We do that with our clients. The reason why I'm showing it with you is that design is about embracing a lot of ambiguity at the start. It's about being comfortable with uncertainty. It's about looking for patterns. It's about creating concepts with people and discovering what works and what doesn't work early. It's about testing and improving. And then it's finally about saying, let's actually make the change and bring it to reality. So I'm going to cover 7 main points that just to highlight through our experience what it actually means in practice, and I hope that might give you some thoughts for your open state endeavours. So one of them is around to build the capacity to think different. So even in the Ghana example, we spent time actually teaching people, how do you think differently? It's one thing to say it, it's another thing to actually do it. So you have to be different. This particular image was only taken about less than a week ago. As you are endeavouring to be the best state in Australia, so is ACT, so this is a small promo for them. This particular event is actually targeting school children between the ages of 14 and 16 to teach them how design thinking can be used by themselves in terms of dealing with such issues as obesity and diabetes, and actually helping people be equipped to not just say what's the answer, but to be able to sense the possibilities and how to work together to uncover what could be done is what this is about. So in your own endeavours, really finding ways to actually build that capacity and giving people time to say, what does it mean to actually think differently, is a really important step to take, and we see that a lot. And it's fantastic to see young people involved. I know that's on your agenda as well, so we're all in good company in that regard. The second point is about, and this has been mentioned already, is making space for courageous exploration and reframing. It's very easy to say we have the problem, so to speak, and we just got to get on and solve it. What design is asking you to do is to say, well, before you think you actually have worked out what the problem is, why don't you give a bit of space to actually explore, look at the possibilities and look at how you might frame it or reframe it, actually spend time forming the problem, and then think about how you might actually solve it. This particular photo is also not too old, and it's actually an initiative we're working on with the Australian Renewable Energy Agency, and it's looking at how we can increase renewable energy uptake in Australia. And this particular image actually shows a whole bunch of players that wouldn't normally come together. This is part of an innovation lab that we're implementing. And there's an innovator, there's an investor, there is a startup, there is a government person there, there's a designer, there's a network provider, and that's just a small window into quite a large room of people who are representing the electricity system. So you really need to make that space and invite people in and give them tools to think and interact is really critical. So in that particular picture you can see they're building with pipe cleaners and all sorts of stuff, but what they made to that process was quite profound in terms of the future. So just to reiterate, it's important, make space for reframing, and reframing is often from someone else's perspective or multiple perspectives on a particular issue or problem. Spend time trying to formulate what is it we're trying to uncover here, and then spend time really working together to solve that. The third point, collaborate and empower the system to act. It's clearly something that you've got on your agenda, and it's really important. And the collaboration empowered to act, if you think about very large complex systems, it means you do need to invite a lot of people in to that room, just like the room in here. And this particular photo, also recently taken, this is from a project that we're actually running in the tribal lands in California called Del Norte. It's in between San Fran and Portland. And that particular part of the states, they actually distribute funds to the local community to actually invest that and to solve local problems. In that particular instance, they're actually really trying to build the capacity to do that well. So this is a particular project that's looking at literacy or healthier communities. And so we've been spending a bit of time there working with those communities. And this particular picture was actually the launch of that literacy project. And in that room, there were over 200 community leaders, including the heads of schools, school principals, tribal elders, childcare providers, healthcare leaders, the head of the prison, representatives of social and local businesses, youth services, foster care associations, parents. So really having the courage to collaborate, empower people to act. And that particular project, I don't have time today to expand on, but is actually continuing to grow and build, and there's a lot of momentum because of that investment up front to bring people together. And in that empowerment, it's about paying attention to whose experience you want to understand. And so part of design is actually giving voice to all sorts of people's pathways through that system. I refer to Dr. Richard Buchanan a fair bit. He's one of the mentors I had in my journey of learning about design. And this is a really important statement to remember, that no one experiences really one system on itself. You experience life, and in that there's lots of different interactions. And I think it's our responsibility to embrace that and uncover it and to design better pathways for the future. The fourth point is about creating real value for people through empathy. So the value point, innovation, it's all about creating value. However, it doesn't always happen. And it can happen because things are too complex, or we just think it's too rigid, people know where to start, we don't want to change those views, or you've actually tried over and over a number of times, many years, lots of money, and really nothing's changed. And that can happen a lot, and it's unfortunate till some event happens and that can trigger action, which is, it's unfortunate it has to wait for that to happen. In this particular image, this photo is actually about how might we actually create a national priority framework for research into dementia. That's a very complex area, fraught with very smart people. Might be anyone in the room, could be part of that mix. So who decides where priority for research should go? Is it the top 10 neuroscientists, or is it people living with dementia, or the carers who are living with, looking after people with dementia? The answer is all of the above. And this project was extraordinarily taxing on all the designers in the team because it was really tough. But the whole idea about this is that if you want to create real value, you have to have empathy for the system and how it plays out. So in this particular case, they really worked hard to reframe the prioritisation around the experiences of people so that we could say where might we actually start to make some inroads in terms of understanding how things could change. I want to just highlight a useful way of thinking about public value. It's a statement that gets put out there as a bit of a tall, big statement. And we like to break it down a little bit. And Mark Morg talks a bit about this in a book he recently published. But there's something about understanding what value do you create, what value do you add, and what value is actually shared. The reason why that's important is that you as individuals, both literally as an individual or as collectives, as organisations, you do stuff, you make stuff. So you create value of some kind and you should be responsible for whatever that value is and for whom. But then you should also think about your continuum is that you're going to add value to someone else as well. And in fact, multiple organisations here would add value to a person. So how might you see that value being connected through people's experiences? And then the concept of shared value, that's that big stuff, right? That's the stuff that's about reducing carbon emissions. It's about having thriving, innovative communities. It's about making sure we have a safer, more resilient community. They're the big things. So when you're thinking about design and change and innovation, I encourage you to think about the value created along that whole spectrum. And that's actually where you get a lot of energy because people want to be part of the big shared value story. And they also want to know that the stuff that they make goes towards making a difference at the end of the day. The fifth point, the ability to act through doing or experimenting, is very important in design thinking because this is the fun bit. But people get nervous at this bit because they think, well, I don't quite know if it's fully realised or what it's going to look like. But without doing, we don't know what something is or how it might actually work. And what design thinking does is bring discipline to the way you prototype. So you don't just cook something up and then say, what do you think? I just cringe every time I hear someone say that. That's not how it works. Because if I ask you what you think, you'll just go, oh, I don't know, it's out of context. I'm just going to show you a toothbrush. And you're like, what? It doesn't mean anything. But if I was in your bathroom one day and I said, hey, try this toothbrush, you're like, what, why are you in my bathroom? Forget that bit. Point being, here's a toothbrush, use it. There might be a different way in which you might engage with that product because it's in context. So design tries very hard to understand how things will work in situ and that also you're very keen to learn. So the whole idea of acting and doing or experimenting is to learn. And I think we sometimes can confuse words such as failure. I don't like to use that word. I'd prefer to say experiment to learn to improve, whatever it is that you're actually designing. This particular photo is from a project we ran in Singapore to do with the claiming experience of injured workers, which is quite significant in Singapore because they have a lot of foreign workers that are part of that system. And so government recognised that they're probably not a very good experience that they offer. So in this particular example, they said we do prototype stuff, but they weren't aware of how disciplined you need to be to understand how iterative it needs to be to gather feedback and make improvements. And they did a lot of role-playing and different simulations around how that experience might change. So it's not always just an interface or a product, but it's an experience as well. The sixth point is around stories build willing coalitions. So when things are really complex and tough, you need to be able to share those stories. And stories are gathered up through some of the early points that I raised, the exploring and talking and engaging with others. It's about actually exposing your storytelling, not in a polished form, but even in very raw form. So this particular image is the Del Norte project, and there's no external designers in here. This is actually the core team, part of the community, talking to each other about what they've discovered by engaging with quite a broad system of families. They spoke to 27 families in the end and lots of different educators, and were generating insights about what could they do to improve literacy. So design thinking is constantly telling stories and it's constantly sharing that allows people to have little snippets of evidence to say we need to do something different or we are doing something different, this is what it means. So in this particular one, it was actually about influence the school's district board, about what role the schools can be playing in terms of making a difference to young people. The last main point I want to make is that you need to maintain momentum towards the future. And design thinking is all about that preferred future focus. So what that means is that you're constantly asking people to look forward, to look through the barriers and say, can we make it actually possible? And part of that is the energy people buy into, and they continue to maintain that commitment as you move through different stages of a design project. This particular photo is actually, again, it's a Canberra-based photo where there was a whole series of community workshops run during what was called the Innovation Week, and it was about exploring how might Canberra actually generate its own innovation system or network, and how would it be an ecosystem that actually works. So there's something about drawing people together and really focusing on where you're heading is what design thinking is actually about. And that's critical when it comes to change and transformation. So on that note, which I think my time is almost up, they're the main points that I wanted to share with you today. And I hope in that, not so much discussion, I feel like I've had a discussion, there were lots of nods throughout the day, which is great, that it gives you some food for thought for your open state, and I wish you all the best in that endeavour, and I think you're going to set a lot of records in terms of really getting people committed and engaged, which is fantastic.